What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits for the tight end position for Week 4 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Drops, ads, starts, sits, waiver wire, trades, quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, whatever it may be. Let me know down below. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. We do have our starts and sits for every other position, including our must starts at kicker and defense out for the week. So make sure you guys check those out when you have the time. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. Okay, so I did film this after Thursday Night Football, so I just want to briefly mention where the two tight ends in that matchup finished overall. Hayden Hurst had another good week. It continues to be a streaming option, although he had the down week in Week 3 at 1.7 fantasy points. In every other matchup this year, he's had at least 7.4 fantasy points in full PPR. So in Week 4, Thursday Night Football, 11.7 fantasy points, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 27 receiving yards, but most importantly, he did find the end zone. So Hayden Hurst is coming in as tight end number 11 overall at the moment. He's certainly a name to continue to keep an eye on in terms of a good streaming option overall and part of the Cincinnati Bengals. So definitely a nice offense as well. Mike Gesicki, on the other hand, is coming in as tight end 17 overall in full PPR. Finished with 4.3 points in Week 4 versus Cincinnati. Obviously, Tua with the awful injury exited this matchup, so we'll have to kind of see how Teddy Bridgewater affects Mike Gesicki's fantasy stock, which hasn't been amazing. He had the 14.1 performance in Week 2 in the absolute shootout versus Baltimore, but outside of that, no more than 4.3 fantasy points and just 1.6 in Week 3, 1.1 in Week 1. So we'll see if there's good chemistry between Teddy B and Mike Gesicki, but for the moment, he continues to be a sit. So now let's hop into the rest of Week 4's matchups. All right, Vikings at Saints, our London matchup. A little bit of an early game for us here in the United States. So I think Irv Smith is still a viable streaming option, not something I'm crazy about. We just talked about Mike Gesicki being tight end 17. Well, Irv Smith is tight end 18 at the moment. We know he had the goose egg in Week 1, 14.6 fantasy points against Philadelphia in Week 2, and then just 5.2 fantasy points in Week 3 against Detroit. So I don't mind Irv Smith, but I wouldn't get crazy here. Like I have him on the screen, a streaming option is all I think he is until we see a more consistent pattern emerge. Outside of that, for the Saints tight end, they're all going to be sits for me in this matchup. Just not enough consistency here. I will say that Taysom Hill at the moment is listed as the backup quarterback in this matchup, but Jameis Winston having to miss the matchup. Andy Dalton comes in as the QB1, but at the moment, according to my sources, Hill is the backup quarterback in this matchup, which could certainly mean we might see more work out of Taysom Hill. So if you're in a far deeper league, you can roll the dice on Taysom Hill. Maybe he sees some more work overall, but I just think it's far too inconsistent, way too risky of a move. Johnson, on the other hand, who had a decent Week 1 and a decent Week 2, decent at best, had a goose egg in Week 3, just 1 target, 0 reception. So I think he continues to be a sit. And really, the only time you would be considering Johnson is if Jameis Winston is playing, because they do have a pretty nice chemistry overall. But I think both these Saints tight ends will be sits for me moving into Week 4. All right, Seahawks at Lions. Noah Fant is going to continue to be a sit for me, coming in as tight end 27 overall in PPR, 4.6 points in Week 1, 3.1 in Week 2, 6.7 in Week 3, his best week of the year, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 27 receiving yards, but still from a fantasy perspective, it is just not enough to be a start for me unless we see a far better ceiling in terms of a pattern start to emerge, and I don't quite think we're going to. TJ Hawkinson, on the other hand, coming in as your tight end number 13 on the season thus far in full PPR. I do think he is worth a start if he is a lone tight end on your roster, you don't have a better option, I'm fine with Hawkinson this week. He's good to go, fully healthy. He definitely has a nice opportunity in this game where DeAndre Swift will be out and Amon-Ra St. Brown will be out. So hopefully some of those targets start to filter towards Hawkinson. Like I said, tight end 13 at the moment, 7.8 fantasy points in week 1, 5.6 in week 2, 10.8 in week 3. It's a good matchup overall versus the Seahawks, who aren't playing awful defensively, but like I said, with St. Brown out of this game, and although the run game will be fine without Swift, with Williams and Reynolds, I do think there's a nice opportunity here in week 4 for Hawkinson, especially because Josh Reynolds at the receiver position is also a little bit banged up. So it's a good overall game script and a good overall opportunity for Hawkinson moving into week 4. All right, Jets at Steelers. I've got Tyler Conklin as a watch. I get it. He comes in as tight end 4 in full PPR at the moment, which is absolutely crazy through 3 games. Week 1, 10.6 fantasy points, 9 points in week 2, 16.4 in week 3. He's got 24 targets, 18 receptions, 140 receiving yards, and 1 score. So in full PPR, that brings him in as tight end 4. But guys, he's a strong sit back and watch for me because all that production came with Joe Flacco at the quarterback position. We knew coming into the season, there's a lot of buzz about Flacco and Conklin having really nice chemistry, but Zach Wilson is getting the start in week 4. Listen, if Conklin is the lone tight end on your roster, I'm okay with starting him, but we could see a drastic change in production out of Conklin because we just don't know if Wilson and Conklin have that same connection, that same chemistry. So there is a big sign of caution for me moving into week 4. But if we see a good game out of Conklin in week 4, he's probably going to be a start all season long and one of the best waiver wire pickups on the season. So I continue to like Conklin, but I just think we want to sit back and watch and see what happens with Zach Wilson at the quarterback position. Pat Freiermuth, on the other hand, is going to continue to be a start for me, coming in as your tight end 10 in full PPR, at least 12.2 fantasy points in his first 2 games of the season. He's on a really nice pace, and he kind of came down in week 3 versus Cleveland. Not a good game script overall for the Steelers offense, 6.1 fantasy points overall in week 3, but I still think he is a solid start, and if he is your lone tight end, I think he's just going to be a tight end that you're just going to have to ride or die with throughout this season. But I do like him in this game script in this matchup overall versus the Jets in week 4. All right, Bears at Giants. Wow, Cole Kmet actually had a decent fantasy day in comparison to weeks 1 and week 2 and week 3. 3 targets, 2 receptions, 40 receiving yards for 7 fantasy points in full PPR. That is much better than the true goose eggs he gave you week 1 and week 2, but that still nets him as tight end number 52 in full PPR. I am just not confident enough to start Cole Kmet. It's a decent matchup overall, don't get me wrong. If you have to start Cole Kmet, which I highly doubt you do, you could consider it, but I think for about 99.9% of fantasy managers, he's going to be a sit for me here in week 4. Looking at Bellinger for the Giants, he's had a decent last 2 weeks overall. In week 1, he gave you a goose egg, 0 points. In week 2, 8.6 fantasy points. In week 3, 8 fantasy points. So, I mean, you know, if you really were desperate in a deep league, you could consider Bellinger, but I just don't think it's worth it. I don't like the way this offense is looking outside of Saquon Barkley, of course, but with Sterling Shepard going down, I'm just not confident in this Giants offense, at least in terms of the passing game. I think Bellinger in deep leagues, full PPR leagues, is someone you can consider, don't get me wrong, but at that point, you're probably still considering guys like Cole Kmet, so there's not much solitude there. So I think Bellinger, similar to Cole Kmet, for about 99.9% of fantasy managers, is just going to be a sit moving into week 4. All right, Titans at Colts. Austin Hooper is cleared for week 4 after dealing with a neck injury, but he's still a sit for me. He's coming in as tight end 48 in full PPR at the moment. There's just no reason whatsoever to consider him. Jeff Swarm actually had 10.9 fantasy points in week 3 against Las Vegas. He comes in as tight end number 25 overall, so maybe he is the tight end to look at for the Titans, but regardless, I don't like either of these options. There's just not enough consistency or a guaranteed ceiling that makes me feel good whatsoever moving into week 4. All right, looking at the Colts tight ends, they're going to be sits for me moving into week 4. Once again, just not enough consistency here. Mo Alley-Cox had 4.6 fantasy points in week 1, and he's had exactly 1.9 in the 2 following weeks. Kylen Granson, on the other hand, has not had more than 5.2 fantasy points, so we are seeing a little bit of a mixture all around for the Colts tight ends. Jelani Woods, of course, had the big game in week 3 versus Kansas City, scored 2 touchdowns, including the game winner against Kansas City, ended up with 15.3 fantasy points off 2 catches. Both catches were touchdowns. So I do think he is worth looking at, sitting back and watching, but it's definitely not enough of a consistent pattern here to consider him a starter moving into week 4, but maybe some chemistry develops between Jelani Woods and Matt Ryan that is worth looking at. But like I said, moving into week 4, all Colts tight ends are going to be a sit for me. All right, Chargers at Texans. Gerald Everett is coming in as your tight end 8 in full PPR, tight end 6 in standard scoring formats. Week 1, 14.4 fantasy points. Week 2, 13.1. Week 3 against Jacksonville, just a complete down week for the Chargers offense, 4.5 fantasy points. Texans defense is actually playing pretty decent overall, but I still like Everett in this matchup. I think the Chargers are due for a statement game, a close game in week 1, close game in week 2 that they lost, and then not a good performance in week 3 against Jacksonville. I think they need this victory, especially with the amount of injuries that are starting to pile up on this team. So I like Everett, especially in full PPR scoring formats. In terms of the Texans tight ends, there's just nothing to really consider here. I mean, Jordan Akins had 12.1 fantasy points in week 3. It's a good stat line, but he didn't have a single catch through the first 2 weeks of the season. And to my knowledge, he's back on the practice squad, so he's definitely not an option here. OJ Howard had 17.8 fantasy points in week 1. He has not netted more than 1.7 fantasy points in the following 2 weeks. And then Farrah Brown, on the other hand, is probably the most consistent tight end on this team, looking at 2.7 points in week 1, 5.4 in week 2, 6.1 in week 3, and he is questionable for week 4 at the moment. So there is just no reason whatsoever to consider a Texans tight end moving into week 4. Right, Browns at Falcons. Listen, David NJOKU is a solid streaming option, but to me, he is no more than a streaming option. He's good to go. Had a little bit of a knee injury. He's ready to go for week 4. But listen, week 1, 1.7 fantasy points. Week 2, 6.2. Week 3, 23.9. Okay, listen, I think a lot of what we saw in week 3 was due to the specific coverages that the Pittsburgh Steelers were showing in this game and the overall game script. It was a bad week for the Steelers. I get it. It's a really nice stat line. 10 targets, 9 receptions, 89 receiving yards, and a score. I get it. 23.9 fantasy points feels really good moving in to week 4, but I would just tamper your overall expectations. I don't see the same ceiling for NJOKU in week 3. To me, he's still a streaming option. There is a lot of these tight ends, literally from the tight end 10 to 20 range, who are just going to be up and down throughout the season. And NJOKU sits at tight end 9 overall, but I do think he'll slide back a little in the coming weeks. Don't get me wrong, it's a pretty good matchup overall against the Atlanta Falcons, but I'm just hesitant here. We saw a lot of tight ends fluctuate last year in that same range. Really, if you're not in the top 6, you're going to be seeing a lot of inconsistency at the position. I'm just worried because I've seen a lot of you guys and a lot of fantasy managers start to drop valuable tight ends and just try to roll with NJOKU. I think we're going to have some inconsistency throughout the season, so I still consider NJOKU a streaming option moving in to week 4. Kyle Pitts, on the other hand, talk about some inconsistency at the position, comes in as tight end number 16 overall, and I think for a lot of fantasy managers, you just have to start Kyle Pitts if you own him. He finally put up a solid fantasy performance in week 3 with 13.7 points in full PPR, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 87 receiving yards. Fantasy managers were praying for this after 3.9 points exactly in week 1 and in week 2. Listen, like I said, I think if you own Pitts, you just have to ride or die with Pitts. I could certainly see fantasy rosters out there that have Pitts and NJOKU, and that would be a very interesting conundrum. But overall, I think you start Pitts. If you own him, we definitely want to start to see a more consistent pattern emerge out of Pitts and some better usage overall. I just think it's best overall if you own Kyle Pitts to roll with him moving into week 4. Our Commanders at the Cowboys. Listen, Logan Thomas had a down week in week 3 with just 2.5 fantasy points. And listen, it was a really tough matchup. It was a bad day overall for the Commanders offense. Obviously, he still comes in as tight end number 14 on the season. 7.5 fantasy points in week 1, 12.7 in week 2. And overall, it is a tough matchup here in week 4. But I just like these gritty NFC East matchups. Don't ask me why. I just always have faith that they are good enough overall to produce some solid kind of head-turning fantasy stat line. So I like Logan Thomas. I do think you could probably consider him a streaming option. Maybe not the best option just looking at the matchup. The Cowboys are near the top of the league against opposing tight ends. But like I said, I think if you own Thomas, you don't have better options. He's fine this week, but I would not expect a crazy high ceiling overall. Dalton Schultz is still listed as questionable, so he gets an asterisk at the moment. But in my opinion, if he does play and if he does suit up, you just have to start him. Once again, I like this matchup overall for just about everyone involved. I think it's going to be one of those games where the defenses are bending, and I don't necessarily think that either offense is in a great position, but I do think that they will produce good enough fantasy stat lines. And obviously, if you own Dalton Schultz, he has to be a start on your roster moving into week 4. All right, Jags at Eagles. I've got Evan Engram as a sit, but I've got an asterisk there because he's just risky, right? This matchup is not good on paper. This Eagles defense is absolutely humming, man. So I think most fantasy managers are going to want to sit Evan Engram, but I do think you could kind of roll the dice here. I think the Jaguars offense is humming as well, right? But I wouldn't consider this move outside of full PPR. Ingram's coming in as your tight end 15 at the moment. He had a down week against the Chargers in week 3 at 3.9 fantasy points after having 11.6 in week 2 and 6.8 in week 1. So I have him as a sit, but I think in full PPR leagues that are a lot deeper, you can definitely consider Engram. And like I said, if you're in a really bad position and Engram is your only tight end, I think you can, overall roll the dice, because I do like this matchup. I do think that the Jaguars is going to keep this thing competitive, but I'll still give the upper hand to the Eagles, so I'm not necessarily crazy about Engram moving into week 4. Dallas Goedert on the other end, tight end number 6 at the moment. One of my favorite tight ends coming in to the season. 9 points in week 1, 13.2 in week 2, 11.6 in week 3. I like this matchup, and don't get me wrong, Jacksonville's defense is playing good football right now. They have not given up a touchdown to the position on the season, but Goddard is averaging 56 yards per game so far on the season, and we all know that Eagles offense looks absolutely phenomenal at the moment, so I will continue to roll with Dallas Goedert moving into week 4. All right, Bills at Ravens. I would start Dawson Knox, but man, he has been a little bit disappointing to say the least on the season, and at the moment he is listed as questionable heading into week 4. He's dealing with some back issues and a hip issue as well, but I just really love this matchup overall, guys. I do think if Knox goes into this game healthy, this would be an opportunity where he could finally have a double-digit fantasy performance. This is just a game script overall that I want to exploit from all angles. I really think this could be a true shootout and one of the best matchups from a fantasy perspective here in week 4. So I will put Knox as a start as long as he's healthy. Mark Andrews, on the other hand, is tight end 1 on the season thus far. 10.2 fantasy points in week 1, 25.7 in week 2, 28.9 in week 3. He has 3 touchdowns on the season so far, 245 receiving yards, 22 receptions off 31 targets. There's no question whatsoever he is a start moving into week 4, and like I said, and one of the best game scripts in my opinion from a fantasy perspective, Mark Andrews needs to be in your lineup. All right, Cardinals at Panthers. Zach Ertz comes in as your tight end number 3 in full PPR. 11.4 points in week 1, 15.5 in week 2, 10.5 in week 3. There's no question about it. If you own Zach Ertz, he is a start for you going up against a Panthers team that has been very bad overall. The defense is probably looking better than the offense, but man, you just got to think the Cardinals are in position to try and get a big victory after the week 3 loss against the Rams. You got to think that this offense is going to come out and do everything they can to put up some electrifying points. So I like Zach Ertz overall moving into week 4. All right, looking at the Panthers tight ends, there's just absolutely nothing to really discuss here from a fantasy perspective whatsoever. Tommy Tremble has not had more than 1.7 fantasy points on the season. Ian Thomas had 3.3 points in week 3, 2.3 in week 2, 7.3 in week 1, but the pattern there has just not been consistent enough whatsoever. So I would not even start to consider Ian Thomas or any of the Panthers tight ends in this matchup against the Cardinals moving into week 4. All right, Broncos at Raiders. Not a fan of Albert O this season. Gosh, he's been incredibly disappointing for you fantasy managers out there who really believed he was a good late round value. Comes in as tight end 40 overall. A promising week 1 with 6 targets, 5 receptions, 33 receiving yards against Seattle. Netted you 8.3 fantasy points. Then a true goose egg in week 2, 2 targets, 0 receptions. Then 2.2 points in week 3 against San Francisco, 2 targets, 1 reception, 12 receiving yards. He is just not a tight end you can start, and this offense is really worrisome from a fantasy perspective. They are not producing consistent fantasy players outside of Courtland Sutton, so Albert O has to be a sit moving into week 4, even against a Raiders defense that is not playing well. Darren Waller, on the other hand, has been a very bright spot for the Raiders from a fantasy perspective. 11.9 fantasy points in week 1, 17 in week 2, a down week in week 3 against Tennessee at 5.2 fantasy points, but he's still coming in as tight end 5 overall in all scoring formats. He has got to be a start. The Broncos defense at the moment is 20th in the league against opposing tight ends. They have allowed the 8th most points against the position. So Darren Waller is a very strong tight end 1 moving into week 4. All right, Patriots at Packers. There's no way in the world you are considering Hunter Henry moving in to week 4. So far on this season, he has 5 targets, 3 receptions overall, 28 receiving yards. He is tight end 58 in PPR, and Mac Jones is dealing with an ankle injury. He is probably not going to play. Brian Hoyer is probably going to be your quarterback, although from what I've read, there's still a slight chance Mac Jones is going to play, and he is the quarterback who has the history of chemistry with Hunter Henry, although we have not seen a single flash of that this season. So Henry is undoubtedly a sit here in week 4. Robbie Tonyan's coming in as your tight end number 20. I've got an asterisk there because I do think he could still be a decent streaming option after having 9.3 fantasy points in week 3. New England's defense is not playing well. They are giving up a lot of yards through the air. So I do think if you're in a desperate enough position, you could consider Tonyan in week 4. But I think for a majority of fantasy managers, he's going to be a sit. But in full PPR leagues, deeper leagues, he's a decent streaming option. But like I said, probably going to be sitting him for majority of the rosters out there moving it to week 4. All right, Chiefs at Buccaneers. Should be a fun little shootout. Hopefully that Buccaneers offense can start to hum a little bit and we get a good matchup here. Travis Kelce's your tight end 2 in full PPR and in standard scoring formats, so in all formats, right? You're starting Travis Kelce. Is not a discussion to have here. 26.1 fantasy points in week 1, 10.1 in week 2, 17.9 in week 3. Obviously, I mean, like I said, there's no discussion to have here. You are starting our boy, Travis Kelce, moving in to week 4. Looking at the Buccaneers tight ends, it is quite ugly. Although Cameron Brate had a pretty good week 3. He scored 1.7 fantasy points in week 1, 1.9 in week 2. So you're not starting him. There's nothing in terms of consistency here. But he did have 10.2 fantasy points in week 3, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 52 receiving yards. But there are like no receivers on the field outside of Russell Gage and Cole Beasley. So I don't like him in week 4. Kyle Rudolph and just about every other tight end on this team has been completely fantasy irrelevant. So I don't like any of the Buccaneers tight ends. It's going to take a lot for me to consider a Buccaneers tight end on the season, so there are definitely sits moving into week 4. All right, Rams at Niners. I could definitely see this game getting defensive quickly, but I could also see these secondaries breaking. Overall, I like both tight ends in this game, at least in full PPR scoring formats. I just don't know how many touchdowns we're going to see scored in this game. Tyler Higbee has definitely been better in PPR scoring formats thus far on the season. He does have double-digit fantasy performances in PPR in 2 out of 3 games on the season so far, but the important thing is he has netted 24 total targets. Him and Matthew Stafford are starting to look like they have a nice chemistry. I will say it's a tough matchup against the Niners defense as a whole, but I just think if you own Tyler Higbee, unless you have a good streaming option on the bench that you're confident in, which I don't know if there's that many out there, then you're probably starting Tyler Higbee, and you're just, you know, he's one of those tight ends where you're in a position where you're riding or you're dying with him on a weekly basis. So I think it's okay to start Tyler Higbee here in week 4. George Kittle is finally healthy in week 3. He also has a tough matchup against the Rams defense, who haven't been good against opposing receivers, but have performed pretty well against opposing tight ends. He had 6.8 fantasy points in week 3 in his first start of the season, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 28 receiving yards, but that was an incredibly defensive game as well. So listen, if you own Kittle, the ceiling's just too high, man. I mean, if you own Kittle, there is a strong chance that you have a decent streaming tight end hanging around. I would start Kittle because the upside there is way too high, but if Kittle does not perform in this game, we are definitely going to have to start to consider what we're going to do with George Kittle throughout this season. I will say Trent Williams is not going to be playing in this game, which could result in Kittle overall needing to block a little bit more, so that does kind of scare me in terms of his production, but that's just a hypothetical at the end of the day. I do think for a majority of fantasy owners who own George Kittle, it's probably best to start him. Like I said with Higbee, right? Same thing with Kittle. You're going to ride or you're going to die with George Kittle, and at least he brings a very nice potential ceiling on a weekly basis. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out and consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help me out when you guys hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Starts, sits, drops, ads, trades, quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, defense, kicker, whatever it may be. Let me know. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And we do have our starts and sits for every position for week 4 out, as well as our must-start kickers and defenses. So make sure to check those out if you guys want additional help. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.